Chapter 3. The Duke. Tress had noticed that a nice pair of gloves made her daily work go so much better. Now, she made the good kind of gloves, made of soft leather that molds to your hands as you use them, the kind that, if you oil them well and don't leave them out in the sun, don't ever grow stiff. The kind that are so comfortable, you go to wash your hands and are surprised to find you're still wearing them. The perfect set of gloves is invaluable, and Charlie was like a good set of gloves. The longer she spent with him, the more right their time together felt. The brighter even the moon shadows were, and the easier her burdens became. She did love interesting cups, but a part of that was because each one gave her an excuse to come and visit him. The thing growing between them felt so good, so wonderful, that Tress was frightened to call it love. From the way the other youths talked, love was dangerous. Their love seemed to be about jealousy and insecurity. It was about passionate shouting matches and more passionate reconciliations. It was less like a good pair of gloves and more like a hot coal that would burn your hands. Love had always frightened Tress, but when Charlie put his hand on hers, she felt heat. The fire she'd always feared. The coal was in there after all, just contained, like in a good stove. She wanted to leap into his heart, all logic discarded. Charlie froze. They'd touched many times before, of course, but this was different. This moment, this dream. He blushed, but he let his hand linger, and then finally raised it and ran his fingers through his hair, grinning sheepishly because he was Charlie. That didn't spoil the moment, but instead only made it more sweet. Tress searched for the perfect thing to say. There were any number of lines that would have capitalized on the moment. She could have said, "Charlie, could you hold me like this while hold this for me while I walk around the gardens?" Then offered her hand back to him. She could have said, "Help, I can't breathe. Staring at you is taking my breath away." She could have even said something completely insane, such as, "I like you." Instead, she said, hands are warm." She followed it with a laugh that she choked on halfway through, exactly mimicking, by pure chance, the call of an elephant seal. It might be said that Tress had a way with words, and that her words tended to get in her way. In response, Charlie gave her a smile, wonderful smile, more and more confident the longer it lasted. It was one she'd never seen before. It said, "I think I love you, Tress, elephant seal notwithstanding." She smiled back at him. Then, over his shoulder, she saw the Duke standing in the window. Tall and straight, the man wore military-style clothing that looked like it had been pinned to him by the various medals on the breast. He was not smiling. Indeed, she'd seen him smile only once during the punishment of old Latore, who had tried to sneak off the island by stowing away on a merchant ship. That seemed the Duke's sole smile. Perhaps Charlie had used the entire family's quota. Nevertheless, if the Duke did have just one smile, he made up for it by displaying far too many teeth. The Duke faded into the shadows of the house, but his presence loomed over Tress as she bade farewell to Charlie. On her way down the steps, she expected to hear shouting. Instead, an ominous silence followed her, the tense silence that came after a lightning flash. It chased her down the path and around her to her home, where she murmured something to her parents about being tired. She went to her room and waited for the silence to end, for the soldiers to knock, and then to demand to know why the girl who washed the windows had dared to touch the Duke's son. When nothing like that came, she dared hope that she was reading too much into the Duke's expression. Then she remembered the Duke's singular smile. After that, worries nipped at her all night. She rose early in the morning and wrestled her hair into a tail, then trudged to the market. Here she'd sort through the day-old goods and near-spoiled ingredients for something she could afford. Despite the early hour, the market was abuzz with activity. Men swept dead spores off the path, while people gathered in chattering knots. Tress braced herself for the news and then decided nothing could be worse than the awful anticipation she'd suffered all night. She was wrong. The Duke had sent out a declaration. He and his family were going to leave the island that very day. Chapter 4. the sun. Leave? Leave the island? People didn't leave the island. Tress knew logically that wasn't explicitly true. Royal officials could leave. The Duke left on occasion to report to the king. Plus, he'd learned all those fancy medals by killing people from a distant place where they looked slightly different. He'd apparently been quite heroic doing those works. You could tell because of the great number of troops that had died while he lived. But in the past, the Duke had never taken his family. The ducal heir has come of age, he proclaimed, the proclamation announced, and so we shall present him for betrothal to the various princesses of the civilized seas. Now, Tress was a pragmatic young woman, and so she only thought about ripping her shopping basket to shreds in frustration. She merely deliberated whether it would be appropriate to swear at the top of her lungs, and she barely considered marching up to the Duke's mansion to demand he change his mind. Instead, she went on about her shopping in a numb haze, using the familiar action to give her suddenly crumbling life a semblance of normality. She found some garlic she was certain she could salvage, several potatoes that hadn't withered too badly, and even some grain where the weevils were large enough to pick out. Yesterday, she'd have been pleased with this haul. Today, she couldn't think of anything but Charlie. It seemed so incredibly unfair. She'd only just acknowledged what she felt for him, and already everything was turning upside down. Yes, she'd been told to expect this pain. Love involved pain. But that was the salt in your tea. Wasn't it also supposed to be a dab of honey? Wasn't there also supposed to be, dared she wish, passion? She was to receive all of the detriments of romantic affair with none of the advantages? Unfortunately, her practicality began to assert itself. So long as the two of them had been able to pretend, the real world hadn't been able to claim them. But the days of pretending were over. What did she thought was going to happen? That the Duke would let her marry his son? What did she think she could offer someone like Charlie? She was nothing compared to a princess. Think how many cups they could afford. In the pretend world, marriage was about love. In the real world, it was about politics. A word laden with a large number of meanings, though most of them boiled down to, this is a matter for nobles and, begrudgingly, the very rich to discuss, not peasants. She finished her shopping and started up the path toward her home, where at least she could commiserate with her parents, but it appeared that the Duke was wasting no time, for she saw a procession snaking down toward the docks. She turned around and walked back via a different path, arriving right after the procession, which began to load the family's things onto a merchant ship. No one was allowed to leave the island, unless they were, instead, somebody. Tress worried she wouldn't get a chance to speak with Charlie. Then she worried that she would, but but he wouldn't want to see her. Mercifully, she caught him standing at the side of the crowd, searching among the gathering people. The moment he spotted her, he rushed over. Tress, oh, moons, I worried I wouldn't find you on time. What did she say? Fair maiden, he said, bowing. I must take my leave. Charlie, she said softly, don't try to be someone you aren't. I know you. He grimaced. He was wearing a traveling coat and even a hat. The Duke considered hats improper wear, except during travel. Tress, he said, softer, I'm afraid I've lied to you. You see, I'm not the groundskeeper. I'm the Duke's son. Amazing. Who would have thought that Charlie, the groundskeeper, and Charles, the Duke's son, would be the same person, considering they're the same age, look the same, and wear the same clothing? Yes. Are you angry with me? Anger is in line right now, Tress said. It's seventh down, sandwiched between confusion and fatigue. Behind them, Charlie's father and mother marched up to the ship. Their servants followed with the last of the luggage. Charlie gazed at his feet. It seems I am to be married to a princess of some nation or other. What do you think of that? What should she say? I wish you well. He looked up and met her eyes. Always, Tress. Remember? It was hard for her, but after groping around for a moment, she found the words hiding in the corner, trying to avoid her. I wish, she said, seizing hold of them, that you wouldn't do that. Get married to someone else. Oh, he blinked. Do you really? I mean, I'm sure they are very nice, the princesses. I believe it's part of the job description, Charlie said. Like, have you heard of the things they do in stories? Resuscitate amphibians? Notice for the parents that their children have wet the bed? One would have to be relatively kind to do these services. Yes, Tress said. She took a deep breath. I would still rather you didn't marry one of them. Well, then I shan't, Charlie said. I don't believe you have a choice, Charlie. Your father wants you married. It's politics. Ah, but you see, I have a secret weapon. He took her hands and leaned in. Behind, his father moved up to the prow of the ship and looked down, scowling. Charlie, however, smiled a lopsided smile. His "look how sneaky I am" smile. He used it when he wasn't being particularly sneaky. What kind of secret weapon, Charlie? I can be incredibly boring. That's not a weapon. It might be one in a war, Tress. Might not be one in a war, Tress, he said, but in courtship, it's as fine a weapon as the sharpest rapier. You know how I go on and on and on? I like how you go on, Charlie. I don't mind the on. In fact, I sometimes quite enjoy the on. You're a special case, Charlie said. You are, well, this is kind of silly, but you're like a pair of gloves, Tress. I am, she said, choking up. Yes, don't be offended. I mean, when I have to practice the sword, I wear these gloves, and I understand, she whispered. From atop the ship, Charlie's father shouted for him to be quick. Tress realized then that, like Charlie had different kinds of smiles, his father had different kinds of scowls. She didn't much like what the current one implied about her. Charlie squeezed her hands. Listen, Tress, I promise you, I'm not going to get married. I'm going to go to those kingdoms, and I'm going to be so insufferably boring that none of the girls will have me. I'm not good at much. I've never scored a single point against my father in sparring. I spill my soup at formal dinners. I talk so much, even my footman, who is paid to listen, comes up with creative reasons to interrupt me. The other day, I was telling him a story about the fish and the gull, and he pretended to stub his toe, and the Duke shouted again. I can do this, Tress, Charlie insisted. I will do this. At each stop, I'll pick out a cup for you, all right? Once I've bored the current princess to death, and my father has decided we need to move on, I'll send you a cup. As proof, you see? He squeezed her hands once more. I'll do it not only because you listen, but because you know me, Tress. You've always been able to see me when no others don't. He began turning to finally respond to his father's shouts. Tress held on, clinging to his hands, unwilling to let it end. Charlie gave her one last smile, and though he was plainly trying to act confident, she knew his smiles. This one was his uncertain one, hopeful but worried. You're my gloves too, Charlie, Tress said to him. After that, she had to let go so he could jog up the plank. She'd imposed enough already. The Duke forced his son below decks as the ship slipped off the dead gray spars nearest the rock and into the true verdant ocean. Wind caught the ship's sails, and it struck out toward the horizon, leaving a wake of disturbed emerald dust behind it. Tress climbed up into her house, then watched from the cliff until the ship was the size of a cup, then the size of a speck. Then it vanished. After that, the waiting began. They say that to wait is the most excruciating of life's torments. They, in this case, refers to writers who have nothing useful to do, so fill their time thinking of things to say. Any working person can tell you that having time to wait is a luxury. Tress had windows to wash, meals to cook, a little brother to watch. Her father, Lim, had never recovered from his accident in the mines, and though he tried to assist, he could barely walk. She helped Tress's mother. Olba knit socks all day, which they sold to sailors, but, at the expense of yarn, they turned only a meager profit. So Tress didn't wait. She worked. Still, it was an enormous relief when the first cup arrived. It was delivered by Hoyd, the cabin boy. Yes, that's me. What tipped you off? Was it perhaps the name? A beautiful porcelain cup without even a single chip in it. The world brightened that day. Tress could almost imagine Charlie speaking as she read the accompanying letter, which detailed the affections of the first princess. With heroic monotony, he had listed the sounds his stomach made when he lay in various positions at night. As that hadn't been quite enough, he then explained how he kept his toenail clippings and gave them names. That had done it. Fight on, my loquacious love, Tress thought as she scrubbed the mansion windows the next day. Be brave, my mildly gross warrior. The second cup of pure red glass, tall and thin, and looked like it could contain more liquid than it actually did. Perhaps it came from a particularly stingy tavern. He'd put off this princess by explaining what he'd had for breakfast in intricate detail as he'd counted the pieces of the scrambled egg and categorized them by size. The third cup was an enormous solid pewter tankard with a heft to it. Perhaps it was from one of those places Charlie had made up, where people always needed to carry weapons. Tress was reasonably certain she could knock out an attacker by swinging the tankard. The latest princess hadn't been able to withstand an extended conversation about the benefits of various punctuation marks, including a few Charlie had invented. The fourth package card included no letter, but only a small drawing, two gloved hands holding to one another. The cup had been a painted butterfly on it with a red ocean underneath. She found it odd that the butterfly wasn't terrified of the spores. Maybe it was a prisoner forced to fly over the ocean to its doom. The fifth cup never arrived. Tress tried to play it off, telling herself that it must have been interrupted in transit. After all, any number of dangerous things could happen to a ship sailing on the spores. Pirates are, spores. But the months stretched long, each more tedious than the one before. Every time a ship arrived at the docks, Tress was there asking for mail. Nothing. She did this for months on end until an entire year had passed since Charlie had left. And finally, a note. Not from Charlie, but from his father, sent to the entire town. The Duke was returning to Diggins Point at long last, and he was bringing his wife, his heir, and his new daughter-in-law. And that's the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5. The Bride. Tress sat up upon her porch, leaning against her mother, and watched the horizon. She held the last cup Charlie had sent, the one with the suicidal butterfly. Her lukewarm tea tasted of tears. It wasn't very practical, she whispered to her mother. Love really is, her mother replied. She was a stout woman with a cheerful kind of girth. 5 years ago, she'd been thin as a reed. Then Tress had learned her mother was giving up a portion of her food to her children. From then on, Tress had taken over shopping and had made their money stretch further. A ship appeared on the horizon. I finally thought what I should have said. Tress pushed her hair out of her eyes. When he left, I called him a glove. It isn't so bad as it sounds. He'd just called me one, you see. I've had a year to think about it, and I realize I could have said something more. Her mother squeezed her shoulder, and the ship drew inevitably closer. I should have said, Tress whispered, that I love him. Her mother joined her as she marched, like a soldier on the front lines facing cannon fire, down to the docks to greet the ship. Her father, with his bad leg, stayed behind, which was good. She feared he'd make a scene the way he'd been grumbling about the Duke and his son the last few months. But Tress could not find it in herself to blame Charlie. It wasn't his fault that he was the Duke's son. It could have happened to anyone, really. A crowd had gathered. The Duke's letter said he wanted a celebration, and he was bringing food and wine. Whatever else people thought of getting a new future Duchess, they were not going to miss out on a chance for free alcohol. As it has ever been, gifts are the secret to popularity. That and having the power to behead anyone who dislikes you. Tress and her mother arrived at the back of the crowd, but Holmes, the baker, waved them up on his steps so they could see better. He was a kind man, always saving the ends of loaves and then selling them to her for pennies. So it was that Tress had a good view of the princess as she appeared on the deck. She was beautiful, rosy-cheeked, shimmering hair, delicate features. She was so perfect, the finest painter in the seas couldn't have made improvements in her portrait. Charlie had at last been able to become part of a story. With effort, Tress was happy for him. The Duke appeared next, waving his hand so that people would know to cheer for him. I present, he said, my heir. A young man stepped onto the deck beside the princess, and most definitely was most definitely not Charlie. This young man was around the same age as Charlie, but he was 6.5 feet tall, and he had a jaw so straight it made other men question if they were. He bulged with muscles to the point that when he lifted his arm to wave, Tress swore she could hear the seams of his shirt begging for mercy. What under the 12 moons? After an unfortunate accident, the Duke proclaimed to the hushed crowd, I was forced to adopt my nephew Dirk and appoint him as my new heir. He gave a moment for the crowd to take it in. He is an excellent fencer, the Duke continued, and responds to questions with single sentence answers, sometimes using only one word. Also, he is a war hero. He lost 10,000 men in the Battle of Lake Privy. 10,000, Tress's mother said. My, that's a lot. We shall now celebrate Dirk's marriage to the Princess of Dormancy, the Duke shouted, raising his hands high. The crowd remained quiet, still confused. I brought 30 kegs, the Duke shouted. They cheered, and so a party it was. The townspeople led the way up the feast hall. They remarked on the princess's beauty and marveled that Dirk managed to balance so well while walking, considering his center of gravity must have been located somewhere around his upper sternum. Tress' mother told her that she would get answers and followed the crowd. However, when Tress came out of her shock, she found Flick, one of the Duke's servants, waving at her from near the bottom of the gangplank. He was a kindly man with wide ears that looked as if they were waiting for the right moment to bolt and fly away. Flick, she whispered, what happened? An accident? Where's Charlie? Flick glanced up at the train of people walking to the feast hall. The Duke and his family had joined them and were far enough away that any skulls would lose their potency due to wind resistance and gravitational drop. He wanted me to give you this, Flick said, handing her a small sack. It tinkled as she took it. Inside were broken pieces of ceramic, the 5th cup. He tried so hard, Tress. Miss Tress, Flick whispered. Oh, you should have seen the young master. He did everything he could to put those women off. He memorized 87 different types of plywood and their uses. He told every princess he met at length about his childhood pets. He even talked about religion. I thought they had him in the 5th kingdom when that princess was deaf, but the young master went and threw up on her at dinner. He threw up? Straighten her lap, Miss Tress. Flick looked both ways, then waved for her to follow as he carried some luggage off the docks, leading them to a more secluded location. But his father got wise, Miss Tress, figured out what the young master was doing. The Duke got right mad indeed. He gestured to the broken cup she was carrying in her sack. Yes, but what happened to Charlie? Tress asked. Flick looked away. Please, Tress asked, where is he? He sailed the midnight sea, Miss Tress, he said. Beneath Tanchimina's own moon, the sorceress took him. Those names sent a chill through Tress. The midnight sea? The domain of the sorceress? Why would he ever do such a thing? Well, I think it's because his father forced him to, Flick said. The sorceress isn't married, and the king has long wanted to try and make her less of a threat, so the king sent Charlie to try and marry the sorceress? Flick didn't respond. No, Tress said, realizing it. He sent Charlie to die. I didn't say anything like that, Flick said, hurrying off. If anyone asks, I didn't say anything like that. Numb, Tress sat down on one of the dock's pillars. She listened to the spores stirring, the sound of pouring sand. Even on an out-of-the-way island like hers, they knew of the sorceress. She periodically sent ships in the raid of the borders of the verdant sea, and it was incredibly difficult to fight her. Her stronghold lay hidden somewhere in the remote midnight sea, more dangerous than all of them. And to get to it, you had to cross the Crimson Sea, an unpopulated sea that was only slightly less deadly. Finding out Charlie had been captured by her was like finding out he'd gone up to one of the moons. Tress couldn't just take one man's word, not on something like this. She didn't dare bother others with questions, but she listened as the servants talked in hushed tones to inquisitive dock workers, eager to get the ship unloaded so they could join the party. They all gave similar answers. Yes, Charlie had been sent to the Midnight Sea. The Duke and the King had decided it together, so it must have been a good idea. After all, someone had to try to stop the sorceress from raiding, and Charlie, of all people, was, The obvious choice for reasons. The implications horrified Tress. The Duke and the King had realized Charlie was being difficult, and their solution had been to simply get rid of him. Dirk had been instated as heir within hours of receiving the word that Charlie's ship had vanished. In the eyes of the nobles, this was an elegant result. The Duke got an heir he could finally be proud of. The King got an advantageous marriage alliance in Dirk's bride from another kingdom, and everyone got to blame another death on the sorceress, building public opinion toward another war. After 3 days, Tress at last dared impose on Brunswick, the Duke's steward, with a plea for more information. As he liked her pies, he admitted that they'd received a ransom letter from the sorceress, but the Duke in his wisdom had judged it to be a trick to lure more ships to the Midnight Sea. The King had declared Charlie officially dead. Days passed. Tress lived them in a daze, realizing nobody cared. They called it politics and moved on. Though the new heir had an intellect of a soggy piece of bread, he was popular, handsome, and very good at getting other people killed. While Charlie had been, well, Charlie. Tress spent weeks gathering her courage. Then he went to ask the Duke if he'd please pay the ransom. Such a bold move was difficult for her. She wasn't a coward, but imposing upon people, well, it simply wasn't something she did. But with her parents' encouragement, she made the long trek and quietly made a request. The Duke, in turn, called her a hazelnut-haired strumpet and forbade her from washing windows anywhere in town. She was forced to begin knitting socks with her parents for a greatly reduced pay. As the weeks passed, Tress fell into a lethargy. She felt less like a mere human being and more like a human who was merely being. Life on the rock for everyone else returned to normal. Easy as that. Nobody cared. Nobody was going to do anything until it was 2 months after the Duke's return that Tress made her decision. There was somebody who cared. Naturally, it would be up to that person to do something. Tress couldn't impose on anyone else. She was going to have to go rescue Charlie herself. And that's the end of part 1.